I was born on a summer day, July 10th, 1871, just as Paris was struggling to remember itself after the thunder of war. My first breath arrived in a world of cobblestones still trembling from the Franco-Prussian conflict, in a suburb of Paris that felt both close to the city's heart and just far enough to hear it beating. My father, Adrien Proust, was a distinguished physician, brisk and precise, a man who believed that the body could be taught obedience. My mother, Jean Vile, was warmth and intelligence braided together. Through her I learned the music of words, the measured tenderness of sentences, the comfort of a book offered like a hand. From the start I was a fragile child, lungs rebelling at spring, at dust, at laughter, at the simple insistence of air. Asthma seized me in the night, and so the night became my companion. I learned to listen to the dark as if it were a library. My childhood held two cities, Paris, with its salons of conversation and windows burning late, and Cambrai, which you may know by that fictional name, though it is stitched from the very real village of Elias and from my own memory. In Cambrai, time gathered in pools, church bells that fell like pebbles in the afternoon, the smell of hawthorn hedges after rain, a teaspoon tapping the side of a cup. I came to understand that memory is not a matter of will but of ambush. It arrives when it pleases, in crumbs of cake, in a whiff of damp stones, in the creak of a stair. My earliest education was not only at the Lycée Condorcet, where I studied Greek, Latin, and the austere kindness of good teachers, but also in the private discipline of noticing. I watched the way a curtain breathed in a draught, the shyness of a lamplight in a corridor, the pride that makes people talk too loudly when they are uncertain. As I grew, illness fastened me to rooms and left me there with my books. What illness took from the lungs, it sometimes returned to the eyes, an appetite for detail, a patience for quiet catastrophes. I visited salons where conversation was the currency and social rank the grammar. There, a dropped name or misplaced compliment could alter destinies. I observed the choreography of desire and power, the little masquerades people perform in order to remain in good standing with the world. I began to write, first sketching society as if it were a living tapestry, then adding my thread to it. My earliest published work, Les Plaises et les Jours, was a bouquet gathered a little too carefully. The flowers were arranged, the ribbon tight. The critics smiled. I smiled back, knowing that the real work, long, secret, and consuming, was still ahead. Two forces, seemingly opposite, trained me. Love for my mother and the staying apprenticeship of loss. My father's death came, and then, a few years later, the devastating silence of my mother's absence. In that hush, where every room seemed suddenly too large, I discovered that grief is a country with its own weather. I began to translate John Ruskin, not only to bring his language into mine, but to understand how seeing itself can be a moral act. By day, I learned to love cathedrals as one loves people, through patience, through attention to the smallest carvings. By night, I tested sentences in the air of my bedroom until they surrendered their breath. I experimented with a new instrument, time, not as a straight road but as a spiral in which the present, the past, and the future brushed shoulders like strangers on a narrow boulevard. Paris, the Paris of salons, of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, of gossip arranged like fruit on silver trays, offered me more than divertisement. It offered me characters, the proud, the anxious, the cruelly witty, the surprising, the tender. I watched the Dreyfus affair split the city like a seam. I took the side of justice and paid for it in invitations rescinded and looks that froze mid-air. Yet even in that furor I recognized material for a larger project. The way convictions become costumes, and costumes, if worn long enough, turn into skin. The world around me felt dense with meaning, crowded with symbols waiting to be unwrapped. I kept gathering them, patient as a collector arranging stamps in an album that would someday become a map. What followed was a retreat that looked like surrender. I withdrew from the visible city to build one of my own. I laid my bedroom with cork to soften the footsteps of the outside world and to magnify the echoes within. There, at odd hours, often when others slept and I felt most awake, I began the work that would be my true life, a La Recherche du temps perdu, which you may call In Search of Lost Time. I did not set out to write a novel in the conventional sense, with an obedient plot and a punctual ending. I wanted to create a cathedral made of sentences, a place where memory could light candles and where jealousy, love, art, and habit could parade in their contradictory finery. My instrument was the long sentence, winding yet precise, the better to catch a thought before it escaped, the better to show how one sensation dissolves into another like sugar in tea. The first volume, Swan's Way, took the world by surprise and not always with kindness. Some found it too long, too detailed, too concerned with the play of light on a teacup or with the small humiliations that make up society. But others recognized the wager, that the trivial is a mask worn by the essential, that what we call small is often immense when one looks closely enough. The episode of the Madeleine, a piece of cake pressed against the palate, and suddenly a lost village, a child's bedtime, a mother's voice all return, was not a trick but a confession. Memory has its own geometry. It is not chronological, it is vertical, plunging through the layers of a life to touch a foundation stone that still radiates warmth. As the volumes multiplied, so did the people within them, lovers whose tenderness battled their need for control, aristocrats desperate to maintain a hierarchy collapsing from within, artists struggling to snatch truth from a world that prefers comfortable lies. Among them moved the narrator, who is and is not myself, testing the truth of feeling against the evidence of time. I assembled salons alive with vanity, friendships that curdled into rivalries, romances that were also prisons. Jealousy, in particular, fascinated me. How it feeds on imagination more than fact, how it invents the very torments it cannot endure. I studied desire as a scholar studies a rare text, not to scold it but to understand the language in which it speaks. The war arrived with the sound of distant thunder and the sharp crack of absences. Paris dimmed its lights and learned to speak in whispers. The world that I had set about recording, the fragile arrangements of society, the gossip that sailed from table to table, suddenly seemed less permanent than ever, like theatre sets trembling under a draught. Yet even war, with its grief and its ruptures, insisted on the same truth my work had been circling. That time is the true protagonist of every life. People change, places change, and yet, through some alchemy of memory and art, meaning can be recovered, like a photograph developed long after it was taken. Recognition came, though not all at once. A great prize arrived like a bell rung in a far room, and with it the knowledge that my seclusion had not been a disappearance but a concentration. Still, the applause outside the cork-lined room never meant as much to me as the moments inside it, when a stubborn paragraph finally yielded its shape, or when a passage balanced and the rhythm revealed itself like a coastline from a fog. Writing, for me, was not an act of improvisation. It was excavation, clearing away habit, convention, and the cheap varnish of everyday explanations to find the bedrock of feeling underneath. Each revision was a new descent. People have asked me about truth, whether my book is a confession or a disguise, a diary or a masquerade. I reply that truth in art is not a mirror but a lens. The figures you recognize, those barons of corrosive wit, those young girls in flower, those friends whose tenderness is always bargaining with pride, are both themselves and more than themselves. They are facets of experience cut to catch the light from many angles. I have written of desire in its various costumes, of the way society punishes difference, and then cannot live without the energy that difference brings. I have written of illness as a tutor, of solitude as a theater, of music as a passageway between rooms in the same house of memory. As for style, the long sentences, the digressions that are not digressions at all, I chose them because attention requires time. To attend to a sensation, to a thought forming, to the way an emotion threads itself through the body and becomes an idea, is to slow down. In that slowness, one can hear the hinge of a door, the faintest scrape of a chair, the first snowflake of a revelation landing on the tongue. I wanted sentences that could hold the curve of consciousness without snapping, that could record the mind not as a line marching forward but as a tide folding back on itself to gather more shells. If my life seems to have taken place indoors, in bedrooms lined with cork, in libraries with patient windows, it is because the true journeys were inward. Yet do not think I despised the world. On the contrary, I loved its surfaces because I sensed the depths beneath them. I loved the way certain streets in Paris keep secrets in their paving stones, the way a name repeated often enough grows heavy with echoes, the way a face changes under the pressure of an intimacy that is both solace and threat. Even the cruelty of gossip had its uses. It revealed the rules of a game that people pretended not to be playing, rules that determined who was seen and who was invisible. Near the end of my work, I understood something that had always been there, glimmering at the edges. We do not choose our subject. Our subject chooses us and will not let us go. Mine was time, how it erodes and reveals, how it steals and returns, how it punishes forgetfulness and rewards the one who waits with a patient heart. To write was to bargain with time, to ask that a moment be spared from disappearance in exchange for the devotion of my attention. And in that exchange, I found a strange peace, that what is loved with absolute precision is never entirely lost. If you are listening to me now, perhaps you have already tasted your own Madeleine, already been surprised by a smell, a light, a rhythm that returned you to a forgotten doorway. If so, then you know what I mean when I say that memory is not the past. It is a present in which the past comes to live again. I invite you, then, not simply to read me but to read yourself, with patience and a certain tenderness. Find the through line that ties your earliest afternoons to your most complicated days. Observe how your jealousy tells you what you value, how your boredom reveals your hunger, how the smallest detail, a ribbon, a cough in the next room, can change the temperature of your life. I did not set out to be a prophet or a judge. I set out to be a witness, to show that our inner lives, with their anxieties and ecstasies, are worthy of the same meticulous attention we give to monuments. If I have succeeded at all, it is because I trusted that a long look at a simple thing can uncover a universe. The cup of tea, the country walk, the salon, the kiss, the letter that arrives too late, these are my cathedrals. And if, by walking slowly through them with me, you come to recognize your own reflection on the stone, then the bargain I made with time has been honored. I leave you with this. Every life contains a book, and the first draft is written without our consent by habit, fear, and the expectations of others. The second draft is ours to write. It is harder, certainly. We must edit ourselves, sentence by sentence, until the voice at the center finally speaks without interruption. I wrote to find that voice. May you, in your own hours of quiet, find yours, and may it be as patient with you as you are with it.